that when the heart stops beating, that cardiac death is considered death. Sure, the Talmud in Yuma tells us on page 85 that on Shabbos, if a building falls on somebody, even if they're assumed dead, you have to rescue them, perhaps they're alive. How much do you have to do that's prohibited on Shabbos until we could assume they're dead? The Talmud gives us two opinions. Take off the rubble up until the heart. If the heart's not beating, you could assume them as dead. The other opinion, go up into the nose. If there's no respiratory function, you could assume that they're dead. There is a source for respiratory death, and there is a source for cardiac death. Is there a source in halacha for brain death? Absolutely. The Mishnah tells us in Olos, in chapter 1, Mishnah 6, that when you're a Kohen, is in a room with somebody on the throes of death, you have to be careful. Once they die, they have to leave the room. At what point could we assume they're dead? Well, if all the arteries are hanging out, if their back is ripped open like a fish, they still may be alive. But if they're decapitated, they don't have a head, automatically they're considered halachically dead. The Kohen is tameh, he's impure. Now, is there such a thing as physiological brain death? And the brain is still on, but halachically it's considered so not viable that it's as if you're decapitated. This is very unclear. There have been various studies about complete brain death. It seems a very rare concept that there's absolutely no brain function. However, there are those who argue that even though it's attached, if it's dead, if it's decapitated. There are problems with this. There are problems with all of these theories. Just to give a few examples, if someone's arm isn't functioning, if it's paralyzed, you don't put filler on that arm anymore. It's considered like it's not there. Moshe seems to suggest that blood flow is central, because if someone has gangrene, where there's actually dead, there's no blood flow, then you can consider it dead, you should put filler on your other arm. But if it's just paralyzed, you absolutely have to put filler on the arm. For another example, if somebody, lo aleinu, has a problem with their testes, they're not considered a psuadaka. Even though it's there but it's not functioning, it's very rare in halacha that you could find something that is there but is not, it's considered as if it's gone. So there are arguments both ways. The Gemara in Gittin, Daf Ayin Amud Beis, tells us about somebody who is halachically alive enough to give a get to his wife, because you can only give a get while you're alive, that even if he's cut, which seems to suggest, the Gemara we don't have time to go into, that both the esophagus and the trachea are cut. But he's still somehow functioning. If his hand gives the get to the wife, it's a viable get, which seems to imply that respiratory death is not death. You have examples of polio patients who had iron lungs. You ever see the iron lung machine? So, each opinion that you take of what's considered death has a strange example that seems to go against it. Is that person, those who argue that for respiratory death, is that person halachically dead? You have to bury that person? What about brain death? Is it cerebral brain death, or is it cerebral and brain stem? It has been shown that people who are in the medical community consider brain dead, after a period of time, their brain does turn to mush. Almost like a liquid, like a wax, which Maimonides is one of his examples of what's considered dead. But that takes time. And halachically, if the brainstem is still active, it's unclear. And would cerebral death cause us to say physiological brain death would also be considered by Alzheimer's disease, where the brainstem is functioning, but your cerebral capacities are pretty much gone. These are very complicated issues. Now, back to Moshe Feinstein. The reason why there's such a vociferous debate is specific to Moshe Feinstein and his ruling. Everybody on this issue turned to Moshe. Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, Rabbi Elyashiv, Rabbi Soloveitchik. Everybody wanted to know what he said on this, and he issued 4 or 5 various respondum on this topic. Rabbi Blythe, Dr. Blythe from Yeshiva University, he testified before the commission from the President's Commission on Biomedical Ethics on this matter of what's considered death on July 17, 1980. He testified that Rabbis Feinstein, Hutner, Ruderman, Auerbach, Elyashiv all say that brain death is not considered death. However, in the month of Shvat of Tafshin Mem Hey, anybody know the significance of that in Moshe Feinstein's life? 3 months before he died. Moshe Feinstein tshuva came out in response for Moshe Feinstein. It seems one can infer that there was some type of reversal, that he says that brain death is death. Now it's important because remember that organ transplants can only be done if you consider brain death death. The vital organs, the heart for example, you can only get that if the patient is still somewhat alive. Now the Harvard criteria that was written in 1968 makes it very clear that without determining brain death as death, organ transplants are gone. You have to say that brain death is considered dead so we can have all these viable organs. Moshe Feinstein, in his tshuva, his response to Diane Weiss regarding heart transplants, said the doctor is committing murder twice by taking out the heart of the first patient, taking out the heart of the second patient, clearly saying that brain death is not considered death. However, as we said, in Tavshin Mem Hey, in Shvat, a letter came out written by Moshe that seems to imply, doesn't say it categorically, but you could infer from there that Moshe says brain death is considered death. However, the reason why this is a debate, Moshe, 3 months before he died within his final illness. And if you speak to the doctors who service Moshe Feinstein, they will tell you he was not in any position. The family members, his son-in-law, and others who distributed this letter admitted that it was not written by Moshe, it was said to them in Yiddish. They transcribed it to the best of their ability into Hebrew. Even later, in Tradition magazine, or the journal Tradition, various writers tried to suggest that Moshe Feinstein and others have changed their minds. Rabbi Waldenberg, who was also the Tzitz Eliezer, very clear that brain death is not death. In Tradition, who publishes Tradition? Anybody know offhand? The Yeshiva University? Anybody know? Or do you know who publishes it? It was written that Rabbi Waldenberg changed his mind. Rabbi Waldenberg was still alive, and he wrote a letter to Tradition, which is very rare for a Jew living in Meir Sharon to write to Tradition. And he said, translating this, I was amazed to read in your letter that I had reversed my psak forbidding transplanting a heart or any other vital organ for a seriously ill person where the heart of the donor beats, even if his brain, including the brainstem, is not working at all, which is called brain death. I publicly inform you that as my opinion was then, my opinion is now, to forbid such a thing according to the halakha, and with great emphasis. And he ends the letter by saying, I am amazed and puzzled. How is it possible for a living person to contradict another living person? And you should always remember that when we read responsa, it's not necessarily certain who wrote it. I just want to tell you one quick story, and what this will
Could you just explain what the last statement meant?
What? Well, I'm alive. If there's a question in my rehearsal, you could just ask me. That was, I guess, his point. Years ago, I gave a class on the Shabbos lamp, and the question was if a light, which is electric, is like a candle, which is not allowed to be moved on Shabbos. And I noticed something fascinating. There was a machlokes between Feldheim Publishing and ArtScroll Publishing. And in the Feldheim book of Muktzah, written by Rabbi Bodner, who I knew from Lakewood, he writes a tshuva that he wrote down, speaking to Rabbi Feinstein. Rabbi Feinstein says it is forbidden to move an electric lamp. Okay? In the ArtScroll book, written by Simcha Bodum Cohen, who I went to a shul in Lakewood, he writes that on the aid I saw, he was a student of Rabbi Feinstein, I saw Moshe move electric lights. So this was a very interesting debate when I spoke to both. Rabbi Bodner told me something very interesting. He says that if you look in the back of my book, I say that I spoke to various halachik authorities, and after speaking to them, I wrote down what they told me. When they were publishing the 8th volume of Moshe's Tshuvos, they asked him, could you send us your notes? And he said, well, it's just my notes. It's not what Moshe said. It's what I said. He said, oh, we want it anyway. And if you look, he told me, and he's right, in the 8th volume, they print his notes as if it's a letter to him from Moshe Feinstein. That's a major flaw of the halakhic work. And this is why this question is